All right, so good morning, guys. Now, has anyone ever spoken at a cinema where you only were told you were speaking in a cinema about 90 minutes beforehand? And further to that, you've never seen the presentation before. Can I get a show of hands? Has anyone done that before? Okay. I actually didn't see a single hand. So what I'm going to ask is that everyone be kind to me today. I'm sure the presentation is going to be awesome, but if there is a car crash, at least you have a context as to why. Okay, so thanks for having us today. And Joan sends her apologies. As I said, this was a call that I got during breakfast, so she is unwell. So what I'll be talking about today is the state of radio in 2022. Just like every other medium, we had an interesting time with the pandemic, but it's given us some very interesting green shoots over this period of time. The easiest way to kind of set the scene is to look at radio in terms of its original strength, which is talent, which is local community and content that's happening right now. This is what I mean. So, see, no uncomfortable moment? Okay, so I think, oh, here we go. With this presentation, half the talents that you see there on screen, their shows weren't on air 18 months ago. And if you go back during the pandemic, the footage in that video is of nice promotional video that's all been shot in the last couple of months. But during lockdown, these same shows were being hosted in people's houses. So the mics had to move to the house with all the gear moved to home, just like everyone else, for social distancing. And during that time, what our shows found is that the regular habits changed. So people weren't getting into cars and driving to work and whatever, but they still needed to be kept connected to their community and then their news and what was going on. And particularly in the case of Sydney and in other states too, with every 11 a.m. update came a whole bunch of different news, and radio was walking through those issues and helping people understand how it impacted what was happening in their local community. So what we found is whilst the regular listening habits took a bit of a change, we started to see an uptick in things like smart speaker listening and streaming. And then as people start to get back into cars now, it's a mix of those two. So where I fit into Commercial Radio Australia, I should have actually introduced myself first. I am the head of digital at Commercial Radio Australia. So I oversee things like streaming and podcasts and digital measurement and the like from an industry point of view. So seeing that firsthand was super interesting because this was new territory for us all. So when we look at the numbers, radio listening as a whole continues to be super interesting and robust from an Australian point of view. So if we talk about cinema being the cockroach, I kind of talk about radio being the toaster or the microwave oven. It's that it's there, it's every day, it's a utility in people's lives, but it is in multiple places. So we'll quickly go over where traditional radio starts as the building block of this and the opportunity for your advertisers, and how the new mediums convert from there. So looking at the stats for 2021. So 2021, the context there is that we were in lockdown for some of it. Different states were in varying degrees of lockdown, and obviously Melbourne was hit pretty hard. We've seen continued audience growth across the period of time. So in 21, we had 11.2 million listeners, which is a record high. And it's still driven, even though people weren't getting into their cars as much as they were, it's still driven around breakfast and drive time listening. Looking at the demo breakdown, it continues to be robust across all age groups. So a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is a communal experience in many ways. It is, whether it's the car with the trip to school or the trip to work, or communal listening at home on a radio or a smart speaker. It means that we see those audience figures reflected across all demos. Now, here's the interesting bit. Prior to the pandemic, Australia was in a lucky position where we did 2 world-first partnerships with Amazon and Google for the delivery of live radio to smart speakers. So how it was before is that if you would ask your smart speaker for a radio station, you'd get a very different or random response. So that was all set up and working. And so looking at what happened over the pandemic is that we saw streaming numbers really rise. And it's a lot of it had to do with people at home setting up their home office. So they set up a smart speaker, or it was as crude as people using their laptop to stream the radio. So even desktop and PC radio listening, pretty unsexy, but seeing some over that time browser-led radio listening doing a really nice rise. For those broadcasters that also did a lot of coverage around news and information. It was fascinating talking to them during this period, talking about them telling the stories of seeing streaming numbers that they've never seen before as people tune in for the live broadcasts of the 11 a.m. presser or the breakdown of what happens after that point. So how does radio listening look like once you factor in the 3 ways of listening? As I mentioned, regular radio listening, which is AM, FM, DAB+, continues to be the backbone. It continues to be the big mothership of radio listening. But then it starts to change. So let's look at the differences between Survey 1 in 2017, which is the first bar there, and Survey 1 of 2022. You see linear listening still having the big peak, the big slice of the pie for radio listening, but you're seeing growth in 2 things: DAB+ and streaming. I'll quickly cover off DAB+. So this is the new way of listening to radio, and where we're seeing the rise in the numbers there is from the car. So 80% of new cars sold in Australia now have DAB as standard, and I think what happens here is that people drive out of the car lot and they find the radio, and they find a whole bunch of new stations that are available on DAB. So that's where we're seeing the rise in that, and then streaming is that number that I mentioned previously. And if we were to break it down year by year, 20 and 21 saw the big upshots in streaming, particularly with smart speaker listening. So when we look at the streaming benefits for advertisers, each broadcaster now has quite a sophisticated digital strategy around the delivery of their services. So before it was just the stream. Now you're encouraged to download one of their apps. So as an example, ARN have the iHeartRadio app, SCA have the Listener app, Nova have the Nova Player, and 9 Radio have their individual station apps, all with logged in users. All with live radio plus additional content. So what this means is that there is already a data set being collected on each listener when they're streaming, and what we're seeing now is a data-driven application for advertising. So targeted advertising based on time of day, demo, age, location. Now experimentation with things like movement, as in what is being done with the phone at that particular time. So if someone is walking or jogging or running, creative can be customized during the commercial break or during a podcast that's being listened to at the time. and there's a real nice ability to line up where the creative sits on a traditional linear stream, traditional radio, and then tie it in with podcasting and the customization opportunities related to streaming. So podcasts has been an interesting addition to the radio suite of things, and it's kind of like a logical extension where radio is effectively an audio medium, and each broadcaster has an abundance of studios there sitting ready to go that aren't always being used, so it makes sense to apply that to podcasting. So each broadcaster now has a really well-developed suite of original content. So this is podcasts that don't actually ever make it on the radio and have nothing to do with the radio and are not intended for radio consumption. So think about a big radio station like KISS 106.5. It's designed to be listened to as many people as possible, and that's part of its success. It's about what's happening in the city right now. Shows like Carl and Jackie O or Ben Fordham or the like. But podcasts give an opportunity to delve into niches for people who either not as engaged with the radio or have other things going on in their life. So one thing that we launched a few years back was the Australian Podcast Ranker. The Australian Podcast Ranker is a really useful tool to understand comparative performance between podcasts. So I encourage you to look that up. What you see is participating publishers in there measured on the same grounds. So you're actually able to see how many listeners each podcast has in a given month and how many downloads they have. Looking at the stats there, some interesting insights in which Tuesday is the biggest day for listening. So one would have thought that maybe weekends might be the big one for podcasting as people do their leisure stuff, but it's actually Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Tuesday being the biggest, and the biggest time of the day is 7 to 8 a.m. Now, when we line that up with radio consumption numbers, the cume and listening for breakfast shows is still really strong. So this is about people who, as I said, have other things going on in their lives or are just not as engaged with the shows as the big P1s. If I had to point out what the two big growth genres here, they're comedy and news. Now, whilst news only has 92 million downloads, as in its second to comedy, we're seeing a massive proliferation in the rise of news podcasts. So these are 90-second to 10-minute news briefings that cover a particular topic. From an advertiser point of view, the opportunity there is that it's a pretty light environment in which there's often either just one sponsor and integrated either with a presenter-read message or otherwise. So it's very timely stuff. It's not how it used to be with podcasts, that you can listen to a podcast that was recorded 6 months ago. There are podcasts that were just recorded only a few hours ago. So looking at the top podcast for 21, it shows you the varying landscape here. You have your kind of, with my radio hat on here, you have your benchmark radio show there with Carl and Jackie O, but the rest of the top 5 aren't radio shows. Case File is a show that's actually recorded in Sydney by a guy called Anonymous, and Anonymous he talks about true crime, and he was launched one of the world's first true crime podcasts, and so it continues to do very well. And if you look at those numbers, he's often only publishing one episode a month. So some crazy numbers there. And then you have talent there like Hamish and Andy, who are not on radio anymore. So this is a podcast original, one episode a week. And Life Uncut. Now, Life Uncut is a lifestyle podcast of two people in their early 30s, and it's a podcast about life, about money, about relationships, about friendships, about day-to-day living. And what we're seeing now is that this is a show that's on the radio now on Saturdays. So broadcasters are now using this as a chance to put in a podcast to broadcast strategy of finding good storytellers and getting them on the radio. The great story here is that the vast majority of podcasts in the top 20, top 40, top 50 are Australian. So the advertiser opportunity is fantastic here, in which all of these podcasts, and remember too that the podcasts that are in the ranker are not only those represented by radio broadcasters or publishers. There's non-radio entities in there too. And all of them have the opportunity for some really interesting integration because of the flexibility of podcasting. One thing I wanted to quickly cover off is Radio 360. We do continue to get market demands around where is the measurement going for radio. And so Radio 360 this year is a big play related to proactively integrating streaming measurement. So we're seeing people carrying watches and devices around, measuring their real-time consumption of streaming. So we're seeing some real interesting tying of multiple data sets, which will enable us to tell new stories around radio listening this year. So jumping back to podcasts, I think that the big things here that support any activity your clients may have with radio is niche content. So like I said, radio's job is to have as many people listening to it every day as possible, and that's been a very successful business. But the opportunity now is also with niche to support that message delivery that you might have with your clients. So there's niche content, there's flexibility around the creative, a targeted audience, and a strong connection with brand. So let me give you an example of flexibility around creative. There's quite a few of them. There's a betting company that talks about the love of sport. Now, betting is a pastime that is typically Friday, Saturday, Sunday, isn't it? So how the advertising creative works is on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, if the listener is listening then they'll get some fairly general brand messages related to betting and sport. But as you start to get closer to Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the time of day, the podcast advertising changes. So you're getting information about odds, about particular events that are happening, and that's targeted creative. So, and the barrier to entry for that is actually quite low nowadays because the cost of the tech has come quite down. So it's just about understanding, your clients and what their needs can be with time of day and days of the week and those kind of things. And there's good opportunities there. So in summary, I think I did okay. So in summary, traditional radio is the backbone. It is AM, FM, DAB+. It is local connected shows doing big things that connect with their local cities, news and information. What we found is that any changes that came to radio listening during the pandemic kind of came back to help us with the listener now understanding that they can listen not just in the car on the radio, but listen on a smart speaker or listen on a dedicated station app or an app like Radio app. So radio is the cornerstone, but there is now new elements such as streaming and podcasts and live events, as you saw in that video there. Okay, right, to finish off here, it all comes down to good creative. So CRA runs an annual awards with the Sirens Council called the Sirens Awards, which really encourages creative. Tech and data and all of this kind of stuff, it still all comes down to good creative. So I'm going to play the winner of 2021's Best Radio Campaign, which was M&C Saatchi's Ugly But Good For You campaign for Lilydale and Steggles. And here it is.
Holding a birthday party for your 5-year-old. Ugly, but good for you. When you don't want to leave the club, but now you're having to be told. Ugly, but good for you. Doing fitness classes in the public park. Ugly, but good for you. When you don't know how to dance, but now you think it's time to start. Ugly, but good for you. Ugly is good for you.
Okay, thanks guys. Thank you for hanging in there with me. Appreciate your support. Thank you. Thank you.